Hi everyone. It's nice to see so many people willing to spend a Saturday in here rather than out in the sunshine in the great cause of freedom. It's very exciting. I really appreciate the opportunity to chat with you today. An event like this is really important, and as I hope you might appreciate by the end of this talk, if you didn't already do so, it's potentially the kind of event that's under threat in a world where cultural Marxism has become just so very dominant and its effect on free speech has been aggressive and chilling. Despite his big government tendencies, I still have some admiration for Ronald Reagan. And he had this really great turn of phrase, a good way of expressing himself. And he said, freedom or liberty is the right to question and change the established way of doing things. It's the continuous revolution of the marketplace. It's the understanding that allows us to recognise shortcomings and seek solutions. Now, you could think about marketplace there in its commercial sense, but it can also be, and I think it was intended to also cover, the marketplace for ideas. A week or two ago, when he launched his book in Brisbane, John Howard made his usual kind of common sense observation that politics was always meant to be about the battle of ideas. But a battle of ideas is only sustainable when a field for that battle is preserved, when the battle is allowed to take place. And increasingly these days there's a sort of forced pacifism rather than a direct battle. So there's a closing down of the field of debate, discussion and opinion, and that's increasingly the norm in our public spaces, in our workplaces, and even in our social groups. When I use the word pacifism, though, there needs to be an acceptance of responsibility by those in the silent majority too. There's been, by those who don't prescribe to the cultural Marxist way of thinking and doing, a checking out mentally and a preference for just living your own life according to your own beliefs and your own values and not bothering to engage with those around you lest it cause offence or discomfort. And that has fed into or enabled minority fundamentalists to succeed. I think it's pretty fair to say that Mr. Howard is someone who's in the Ronald Reagan type of mould. You know, he might like government to be a bit bigger than we would, but he was very good at studying society and making cogent observations on behaviour and delivering those, you know, quite bravely for their time. In the foreword to Peter Curdy's book, The Tyranny of Tolerance, Howard wrote, "The quality of public debate in Australia has recently taken a dramatic turn for the worse. Intolerance and bigotry have been displayed towards people expressing traditional, or even not so long ago, mainstream, or the status quo type views on social issues. And that's occurred incredibly enough in the name of greater tolerance or acceptance of other points of view. We can even point to examples, for instance, of companies having been targeted or vilified because they have facilitated a debate between different points of view, or other companies that have been targeted or vilified because they had someone on their board or someone as a senior officer who had a view that didn't align with that of the cultural Marxists. The trend represents whatever your beliefs on social type policy issues, it represents a root and branch attack on free speech. So Howard labelled this phenomenon minority fundamentalism, and that's the theme I'll try and develop a little bit more. I acknowledge that minority groups throughout history have often been subject to persecution and discrimination. For example, the Jewish people have suffered through hundreds of years of persecution through Europe, long before the Holocaust, and of course that continues somewhat, even in the State of Israel. However, it seems now that the pendulum has swung so far that those who claim a minority status are able to use it to shout out or silence those who don't share that quality. So quite rightly, there's no place for discrimination in a civilised society on the basis of qualities that are unfair. But when reverse discrimination occurs, it's equally appropriate to challenge it in all its guises. But that's a quality that's sorely lacking in much of Australia's public debate. Instead, we've got this increasingly self-assertive minority, even an incentive for one to find a basis upon which they could claim minority status, so that it can be used to condemn and silence others. If your opinion has a special status because you have a minority characteristic, it does very dangerous things for the ability to test the quality of those beliefs. Cody made the observation, it's no longer the display of personal conviction that counts, but the deliberate or even ostentatious display of what is presented as tolerance. In truth, this tolerance is not open-mindedness, it's instead a form of moral relativism that's concerned with elevating the rights and interests of any who are perceived to be the victims of discriminatory or marginalising behaviour at some point in time. Putting all of that more simply, it's a form of virtue signalling. So why has there been this growth in minority fundamentalism? Well, I've already alluded to an important factor in it, and that there is this strong link between the rise of cultural Marxism and the rise of minority fundamentalism. It has helped minority groups to become more organised and confident in asserting themselves in public debate, but that's not the whole story. The most zealous of them have now developed a strategy that relies on demeaning others, often through verbal abuse and physical abuse. And if you had any doubt about that, you could think only to a week or two ago when there were attempts by extreme cultural Marxists to shut down Bettina Arndt's lectures on Sydney University's campus. You could also point to examples from states such as Victoria, where people who gather and peacefully discuss a controversial point of view in a way that should be within the bounds of free speech and entirely acceptable, are being billed for the costs associated with other extremists' behaviour on the streets. It's a bizarre phenomenon. But prior to that kind of direct confrontation, there's a process of change that happens outside of the wider view of people. There's a significant problem at the moment, I think, with the implementation of serious changes in social policy by unelected and unaccountable groups, such as public servants. That's only possible because minority groups have had tremendous success in establishing clout and influence in our most important institutions, in our centres of cultural and political power. This has enabled them to achieve social change far more quickly than they would have if they had undergone the ordinary rigmarole of going through the democratic process. One could look to the example of the establishment of They Day in the Victorian Public Service, a day in each month where gendered language is eschewed because it is just so very oppressive. I think it's possibly more oppressive to be drastically changing the way that people are permitted to interact as independent and free human beings by the edict of a completely faceless, nameless public servant. And so we need to, I think, engage with the question of how these significant social policy changes that aren't subject to any form of public or representative scrutiny are able to go through the transition to become conventional wisdom such that they're able to be pushed through a public service, for instance, without there being an awful lot of pushback. In previous times, government agencies set policies that were all about ensuring that they ran effectively and as efficiently as the public service ethic permitted. I'm not going to pretend for a moment that public servants have mastered efficiency in the way that the private sector has. But to some extent, operational policy was required for government agencies to operate. And a good policy in one agency might, if it all turned out well, be adopted by another agency because it had been tested and it might indicate there was a smart way to deliver services to the public. But now, operational policy of government departments, maybe that's only the start, has intruded into the realm of social thinking with no mandate, it being utterly irrelevant to the core business of that department and in a way that undermines representative processes. There are many actions that appear minor one by one and can be badged using management speak as best practice or contemporary practice. But when you take them in aggregate, they have a significant capacity to transform the way the members of a society interact. Setting new standards is not only restricted to those people who want to make a mark in the public sector, it's becoming conspicuously apparent in the private sector too. So I'd like to go now and talk a little bit about the way the concept of the social licence has been pushed into the corporate sector. It was to David Murray's credit, and he's currently the chairman of the AMP, you'll know that he was formerly with CBA, that he called out proposed changes to the ASX's corporate governance guidelines. And those guidelines were to introduce this concept of a social licence to operate. He called that out as a distraction that would weaken board accountability. So those draft guidelines required public companies to preserve their social licence to operate by having regard to the views and interests of a broader range of stakeholders than just the entity's security holders. The stakeholders you would expect public companies to account for in running their business include everybody from the employees, customers, suppliers, creditors, virtually anyone in between. And while the guidelines are not legally binding, those companies which choose to implement a different kind of corporate governance approach are expected to front up and explain why they've departed from what should be regarded, they say, as the received wisdom of the ASX. Murray was one of a lonely few to even scrutinise the idea of forcing companies to lift their gaze from their core business and factor in the needs of society at large. And it's a really good thing he did. Encouraging corporate executives and boards to try and square the interests of their shareholders with some undefined notion of the greater good is a Trojan horse for importing social activism into the boardroom. To most of us, the idea that companies should take stock of how their actions affect the world around them sounds pretty simple, something of a no-brainer. And the truth scarcely acknowledged is that corporations have been entitled to take account of the interests of society and the social goods that they might deliver for more than 100 years. In the 1880s, Lord Justice Bowen proclaimed that the law does not say that there are to be no cakes and ale, but that there are to be no cakes and ale except such as are required for the benefit of the company. And that's really the guts of it. A company is established to deliver for shareholders. It is the shareholders' interests that should always be within the gaze of the board. It's quite disturbing if we're going to fundamentally change the purpose of a corporation into being something of a social activist group or community service delivery agency. The takeout from Lord Justice Bowen's point was that it's perfectly fine for a company's board to have an eye to the wider interests of the community, provided that doing so doesn't come at the expense of shareholders' interests. Decisions which eschew short-term profit to preserve a company's good name and brand, for instance, are perfectly consistent with acting in a shareholder's interests. But if the concept of a social licence were to be implemented in the way the ASX has contemplated, it would turn the most fundamental principle of corporate law on its head. Of course, asking the boards and executives that are the custodians of much of Australia's wealth to reconcile the interests of shareholders with an open-ended list of stakeholders raises pretty difficult questions in practice. After all, what might serve the interests of the community, the taxpayer and the society can be in the eye of the beholder. Take the issue of goods that are produced in sweatshops in the developing world. They're a perennial object of scorn for activists and NGOs around the world. Major Australian retailers like Target, Kmart and Big W, among others, have come under scrutiny for their use of cheap labour factories in developing nations. If you take Oxfam at their word, sweatshops are exploitative and inherently immoral. On the other hand, there's a plausible view held by a range of leading economists that what we might call sweatshops in fact provide an all-important first step towards economic development in parts of the world that don't have it. Factory workers in Bangladesh, Ethiopia and the Philippines, for example, typically earn wages well above their country's median income, while the investment of foreign capital in the businesses producing these goods helps to spur economic growth throughout the economy in the long run. Like any issue worth debating, these types of businesses raise difficult questions on which reasonable minds can, of course, disagree. But granting public companies a social licence to operate provides a mechanism by which people who adopt one position in that debate are able to use the notion of a licence to shut down the right of those who hold contrary views to participate in the debate at all. It will also embolden boards and executives to impose their own view of what amounts to an ideal society upon all in their company under the flimsy guise of having considered stakeholders' interests. It also allows an awfully flexible means of avoiding shareholder responsibility for lower performance. Although the concept of stakeholders' interests is impossibly malleable, the ASX hasn't been shy in offering up its own suggestions about the types of concerns companies ought to have in the front of their mind. Some of the buzzwords that follow the guidelines' first mention of social licence to operate include providing workers with a living wage, avoiding aggressive tax avoidance. Tax avoidance is already against the law. Tax minimisation is thoroughly legal, and upholding human rights. There are entire paragraphs devoted to the twin dogmas of diversity and gender targets, effectively stating that companies which are yet to adopt aggressive gender quotas are on the wrong side of history and are in some way offending against concepts of human rights. These are the kind of clichés you'd expect to read on a Get Up How to Vote card, not the rule book for directors sitting at the helm of Australia's biggest stores of domestic wealth. In the guidelines, directors are also cautioned to be wary of their perceived impact on the environment, perceived impact being the relevant quote there, as though the mere perception of environmental damage is something companies ought to preempt, that it's not enough for them to, in fact, care for the environment or at least do no harm. This removes any doubt that the underlying intent of the changes is to deter practice or conduct that falls short of what the ASX regards as the social policy zeitgeist. The true purpose, really, is to rewrite the norms of the corporate world using the same playbook that is being followed in the march through the institutions of our universities and our schools. From a tactical point of view, pursuing this kind of unlegislated change makes an awful lot of sense. After all, polls and elections bear out time and time again that the mainstream of Australia is not especially radical. And if the Marxists had to make their case lay all their cards on the table, they'd be pretty unlikely to succeed. Initiating social change instead by chipping away at social norms and infiltrating unelected positions of power is a far quicker route to achieving political change pardon me, than going through the hassle of prosecuting their ideas in the public square, of winning the debate. That's what the left set out to do with the United States Supreme Court some 70 years ago. It led to enormous and overwhelmingly left-wing social change. And it occurred without a single vote being cast, without a single politician being held accountable. The pitfalls of granting boards legal cover to moonlight as social engineers are already well documented. Former Dean of the University of Chicago Law School, Daniel Fishel, presciently noted the dangers of corporate social responsibility in a textbook he produced more than 20 years ago. He wrote that a manager told to serve two masters, a little for the equity holders, a little for the community, is in effect freed of both and is answerable to neither. Faced with a demand from either group, the manager can simply point to the interests of the other. The pushback from the business community against the ASX's proposed changes has been tepid, to say the least. Most of the criticism has been through anonymous backgrounding of journalists. With the exception of David Murray, only a handful of those business leaders have gone on the record to make their reservations known. I think I have some time to say something too of the concept of cultural appropriation. Earlier this month, one of Australia's most prestigious writing competitions, the Horn Prize, changed its rules to prohibit entries which purport to represent the experiences of those in the minority community, of any minority community, of which the writer is not a member. The rule represents the idea of cultural appropriation, an academic construct which sees the adoption of elements of foreign cultures as some form of colonialism. Witness the hysteria that sweeps across American college campuses during Halloween each year, when undergraduates have the temerity to braid their hair in cornrows or to dress up as someone from Mexico. Named after one of Australia's most prolific essayists and authors, Donald Horne, the competition seeks entries on the theme of Australian life, shining light on a particular aspect of who we are as a nation from a contemporary perspective. It's worth reflecting that if authors were forbidden from writing about the experiences of people with different backgrounds to themselves back in the 1960s, Horne's most famous work, The Lucky Country, wouldn't ever have been published. As a result, we've been deprived of one of this country's most treasured literary works. We would have been deprived of one of those works, one of the best of the century. The same could be said about Tim Winton's Cloud Street, The Secret River by Kate Grenville, and dozens of other of Australia's most prominent literary works. It's heartening to see that David Marr and author Anna Funder quit the Horne Prize judging panel in response to that rule change. Thankfully, the moratorium on cultural appropriation has since been rescinded, and entrants won't be, it seems, muzzled by this form of political correctness when they're penning their entries. But it does show that there is a push to get as many of these types of concepts through without attracting the gaze of those who might call it out for what it is. Unless we consciously keep up the fight and maintain vigilance with these kind of changes, we shouldn't be surprised if avoiding cultural appropriation soon becomes yet another of the non-negotiable dictum of polite society. A little more than a decade ago, cultural appropriation was an arcane construct that was confined to the ivory towers of elite universities overseas. But if you fast forward to 2016, and Yasmin Abdel-Majed won national praise for walking out of a speech by American author Lana Shriver at the Brisbane Writers' Festival simply because he criticised the debilitating effect of cultural appropriation on fiction and free speech. The furore over Mark Knight's cartoon of Serena Williams' US Open dummy spit shows cultural appropriation has pretty fast evolved from an academic fad into an article of faith among the leftist commentariat. Shriver again recently raised the ire of the outrage police for including an African American character in her latest collection of short stories. Lamenting this sorry state of affairs, she said she was dismayed by how few writers with any serious reputation are willing to put themselves on the line in the cause of free speech. She also observed that the inevitable outcome of this fad is that writers and editors will begin to self-censor in the way that so many members of our community now self-censor their language. Because writers who do this are pilloried for having the audacity to write about the world beyond the confines of their own lives. It's really just the tip of the iceberg. Are we going to confine everybody to works of autobiography? The real cost here lies with the writers who don't have her clout, who will self-censor their work out of a desperate effort to preserve their professional reputation. And there's also the chilling effect that it has on editors, on publications that will then start to shun culturally insensitive pieces, not because they believe cultural appropriation is a problem, but because it's simply not worth the pain and trouble. It's not worth the heartache. For the same reason that members of our community, our neighbours, no longer want to talk about the kind of topics that, despite being really important, are now socially uncomfortable. Cultural appropriation is another textbook example of this kind of unlegislated but significant social change. And while the workings of a parliament are, for the most part, transparent, reported in Hansard, captured on television, scrutinised by the media, viewed by the public in the gallery, these types of processes are completely opaque. It'd be interesting to study the paper and decision-making trail that led to the implementation of They Day, or even the Australian Defence Force's gender guide, or the changes to the ASX guidelines, or even the adoption of concepts of appropriation in the Horn Prize's judging criteria. Was it a person or a group of people in a position of influence to make it happen with their own particular agenda? Or was it simply an overzealous HR manager or an overzealous intern trying to please their very cosmopolitan masters? We running out of time? Okay, cool. Well, I'll wrap it up with this. When most people talk about threats to free speech, it's easy to fixate on the most high-profile injustices, like the victims of Section 18C or the baying mobs of undergraduate Trotskyites trying to shut down Bettina's work on campus. But proponents of liberty need to recognise that they represent only a small fraction of the true toll of censorship. Every day, people are feeling cowed into concealing their opinions for fear of the backlash. Whenever we can, me as a parliamentarian, you as thinking people in your community, whenever we can, we must take the opportunity to push back on this and remind the public that free speech is a foundational value of our democracy, that it's non-negotiable, and that it's central to everything from our freedom to our prosperity. But, as Mark Steiner has often said, state politics is downstream from culture. Unless we live in a society that appreciates the importance of free speech at home and in our streets and with our neighbours, merely repealing 18C will be only a small part of the solution to a bigger systemic problem. I don't have all of the answers on how we go about facing down these threats to free speech, but I do know that I and all of us have a responsibility to reignite the battle of ideas that is so very important to us being a healthy society and a functioning democracy. Thanks.